Okay, so here we go. We're going to talk about respiration in animals. And we're going to start with the lower organisms, the less evolved organisms, and move our way all the way up to the mammals. Okay, all animals have tissues and cells, of course. We've talked about those. And those tissues require oxygen for respiration. And when they do respiration, they produce carbon dioxide as a waste product, which is different from what plants do. So we take in our oxygen, we use the oxygen to burn our food, all organisms do, all animals, and then we release the carbon dioxide as waste products. Okay, so gas exchange in cells, especially like the sponge, let me make this bigger for a second. The water and the nutrients are going to move into the sponge, oxygen coming in, and then after the sponge uses the food and uses the oxygen and produces carbon dioxide and water, and that's going to move right back out of the sponge. So move that back out of the way there. Okay, so a living cell cannot actively pump oxygen or carbon dioxide across the membrane. This is going to happen through a process known as diffusion. The lower animals, like the sponge example, do not have respiratory structures, but the more evolved organisms have respiratory structures, and that's what we'll talk about. So sponges, the cnidarians like the jellyfish, they're going to do all of this respiration through a process known as diffusion, same way that we talked about for circulation. Okay, so gases are going to diffuse across the membrane most efficiently when that membrane is moist, okay, and permeable, which means those gases are able to get through. So I would jot that down if you don't know what permeable means. So this is why we see most of the organisms that have this are like our little jellyfish, okay, because they're in water already, which creates that moist area. Another thing that you might notice is that our lungs are a moist area. So that's going to help that movement of the oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then diffusion, just as a review, is just movement of a substance from an area where there's a lot of it to an area where there's not a lot of it. So when we take in that oxygen, there's not a lot of it in our lungs at that time. So we take it in, then it moves into our lungs, and then we get rid of the carbon dioxide because there was a lot of that in our lungs. So that's why we breathe in and out. Okay, so the requirements for respiration are that we need to maintain relative concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So too much oxygen is a bad thing, but also too much carbon dioxide is a bad thing. So we need to be in what's known as homeostasis, or a balance between the amount of oxygen and the amount of carbon dioxide that we have. Okay. Many aquatic invertebrates and most aquatic chordates exchange gases through gills. So let's just kind of go review this again. Aquatic means water, and invertebrate means to not have a backbone. So these would be the things like our sponges, our jellyfish, that use diffusion, and then things like lobsters, crabs, shrimp. Those are invertebrates that use gills, okay? And then aquatic, again, means water, and chordate is something that has a spinal cord. So then things like the fish and sharks would breathe through gills. But whales are not, they don't have gills, they have lungs because they're mammals. Okay, in the lower organisms, again, we're going to keep going back and forth, sorry. The like cnidarians, which are the jellyfish, and flatworms, which like the tapeworm or the liver flukes. Some of the amphibians, frogs, you notice, will have a moist skin. Roundworms, like those creeping nematodes from the video. And some snakes all have thin-walled bodies, and they tend to be wet. Now, that's not all snakes, because if you've ever felt a snake, you know that not all snakes are wet, but some of them do have an outer surface that's always wet. And when they have that surface that's always wet, the oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to just go through that outer body covering through diffusion. Okay, this is known as, and I didn't write it on here, cutaneous respiration. Okay, cutaneous means of the skin, and then respiration is the exchange of gases. Okay, so let's talk about the respiratory surfaces known as gills. A gill is a feathery structure that exposes a large surface area to water. Okay, and then the membrane that we have here, that selectively permeable membrane, is a network of tiny, thin-walled blood vessels. And these are called capillaries. We have them too. You can see them when you get a bruise, you've busted some capillaries, where gas is exchanged. Okay, so you remember when we talked about circulation, we said that fish and other organisms with gills have a closed single loop circulatory system. That means that the water was coming in to the gills, and then it was going to the heart to be pumped out to the body, and then back to the gills. So we only did one loop. So gills, heart, body, gills, heart, body. So every time that the blood goes into the gills, the water is going to collide with it where there's lots of oxygen, okay? And the gills are going to, the blood in the gills is going to pick up that oxygen and then take it to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. And then it's going to return to the gills. So it's just that one single loop. Fish, especially bony fish, have a muscular mouth that pulls water in. Okay, so they open it, they pull the water in, basically sucking it in, and then they push it out through their gill covering, which is the operculum. Okay, so the water goes in through the mouth, and then into the gills, and then out through the operculum. You'll notice that sharks, I won't draw a shark here, but they have these things called gill slits because they don't have a bony plate like an operculum. So what they have, why they need to keep moving or keep their mouth moving all of the time, is because they have to force that water into their mouth and then over those gills and through the gill slits. So where a bony fish can actually move this operculum by themselves. Okay, so I'll give you a chance to write some of this down. Basically what I was just going over, that most animals, or many animals, like the bony fish, can actively pump water over their gills by opening and closing their mouth. Okay, so again, here is that operculum, water going in and then coming out. So this is another thing that we could talk about here is counter current flow. I don't think that's on the next slide. I don't remember, but counter current flow. Okay, so counter is against the current. So this is that the water and the blood are going opposites of each other, and it kind of forces the oxygen into the blood. Okay, then we've got our aquatic reptiles and mammals, like whales, that are going to breathe with lungs. And they actually hold their breath underwater, sometimes for insane amounts of time. Things that we wouldn't even dream of. An hour, 40 minutes. That's something that, as humans, we do not have the capacity to be able to hold all of that carbon dioxide in without releasing it. So they have a more efficient system than us. Their lungs do exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the air. And that's why you'll see the whales come up, they'll take a big breath of air, and then they'll go right back down. Okay. Now we're going to get to the terrestrial animals. So these are animals that live on land, so terrestrial means land, and they're going to have an advancement of structure. Some of them will have more than one or use more than one of these. We'll go from skin all the way to lungs. Now there are still some organisms that will use diffusion, but again, most of the time those will be found maybe on land, but in a pond on land, so not really truly terrestrial organisms. So here we're just talking about those organisms that live free of water, unless of course it's to get a drink. Okay, and those structures are the skin, mantle cavities, which we'll talk about a little bit more, book lungs, tracheal tubes, and actual lungs. Okay, so the respiratory surfaces on land, we'll start with those invertebrates like the earthworms and snails and other things that do not have a backbone. Earthworms are going to live in a moist environment, the soil, okay, and they can actually respire across their skin, that cutaneous, oops, forgot to change my pen there, that cutaneous respiration. Okay, so one of the things that you'll notice when it's raining like today, where are all the worms? They have come up out of the ground. Their home is soaked and oversaturated with water, and they basically can't breathe. So they have to have, again, that balance. It's all about balance. We'll keep seeing that again and again as we study these systems. So we have to maintain a balance between the good and the bad, or the products and the reactants. Okay. In other invertebrates, like this cute little ugly snail down here, I don't like snails, or slugs, they use respiration through a mantle cavity. And we can see the mantle up in here with the gills. Okay. So now these are a weird type of gills because they're not aquatic gills, so water isn't constantly flowing over them. So this would be like the predecessor to lungs. So we've got a mantle, and the oxygen is able to go in, and the carbon dioxide is able to come out because of all of those tiny little moist blood vessels. Okay, now we get to the next, I'm sorry, I keep saying okay. Anyway, we get to the next group of organisms, some more arthropods, which are the spiders. And I'm sure there's other organisms that have book lungs, but I can't really think of any at this moment. But a book lung, if you can kind of look at this picture here, it almost looks like it's a book or a stack of pages. That's why they call them book lungs, because it looks like a stack. And they're parallel, so they're all lined up with each other. Sheet-like layers of thin tissue that have blood vessels. So now again, they'll be a little bit moist because we have to have that moistness to be able to exchange the gases, but they're going to exchange the oxygen for the carbon dioxide coming out. Okay. Most insects, however, have a very special system of tracheal tubes. We have a trachea, right? That's our windpipe, okay? But they have these things called tracheal tubes, and you can see them down here in the diagram on this grasshopper, that are going to extend throughout the whole body. And at the end of the little tracheal tubes are these things called spiracles. The spiracles are little bitty tiny pores through which the air can leave, okay, enter and leave. So oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide coming out. When we get to our dissections, you'll probably be able to look at a grasshopper, and if you hold up a magnifying lens to it, on its abdomen in this area here, you'll be able to see the spiracles. Okay, so finally we get to the lung structures in vertebrates. These are the highest evolved organisms. When we inhale, take a deep breath in, we're bringing in air that is rich in oxygen, not pure oxygen, mind you, but it has a lot of oxygen in it, okay, a lot more than what we're breathing out, right? We take it in, it goes through the trachea or windpipe, just like those tracheal tubes, and directly into our lungs. The oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood through the capillaries. And again, our lungs are moist. It's not good to be wet or filled with fluid because then you're drowning, but they do have a moistness to them. So the oxygen is going to go into our blood. Our blood gets pumped through our circulatory system all around our body and delivered with the oxygen to the cells that need it. Okay. And then on the way out, the blood is going to pick up the waste product, which is the carbon dioxide. And then that gets carried up into our lungs, and it diffuses out of the capillaries, and that's what we breathe back out. And it's amazing how quickly that process happens, because think about taking a deep breath in and then a deep breath, letting it out, and how quickly that blood has moved in your body, throughout your body, picked up all of the carbon dioxide, and then you were able to exhale it out. Okay. Here we see a picture of the different kinds of chordates or vertebrates on land, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We've skipped birds for a brief moment. They are pretty complex, so we will come back to them. But the amphibians, now sometimes, like with this little guy here, he has some gills here. So what's really cool with amphibians is it means double life, and so they can live in water, and when they live in water, they usually have gills, and then when they grow and move on to land, they develop lungs. So you can see the lung here is very long and slender. Okay. Whereas in the reptile, we're getting a bigger, more complex lung. And then finally, in the mammal, when we have the really advanced trachea and branches on the trachea into the lungs. Okay, and our final slide here is about bird lungs. So we took a step back from the mammals, one evolutionary step down, so to speak, and we're looking at the birds. Birds, obviously, most birds fly, and so they have to have very, very efficient respiratory systems. And their lungs are structured so that air mostly flows in only one direction. Okay, so we have air flowing in two directions. Their air only flows in one direction. This makes this whole process highly efficient for gas exchange and helps birds to obtain the oxygen they need to power their muscles. It takes a lot of energy to fly and to power the muscles to fly over long periods of time. So you may have heard it said that, so-and-so eats like a bird because they just pick at their food. No, if they really ate like a bird, they'd be fat. They'd be eating a lot of food. Okay, a bird can eat its body weight every day. So for that would be like the average person eating 150 pounds of hamburger a day. That's a lot. Okay, so birds need a lot of energy to power those muscles, and they need a lot of oxygen to break down that food to power those muscles. So let's take a little bit closer look at this bird picture. Sorry about that. Moving both things at once here. So we can see the fresh air coming in, and I'm sorry this isn't the best picture here, but we see fresh air coming in, and then only in one direction, and then the stale air or bad air coming back out. Down here. Okay, so the air is going to come in here and then go out there. Okay, let me see if I can find a different picture. Okay, so I found another picture that we can use, and that is for breathing in birds. So now we can see that, let me grab my pen here, the birds have these things called air sacs, okay? And the air sacs are actually going to hold the air. So first breath in, the air moves into the air sac here, and it's held in there, okay? Then when the bird breathes out, that air that's in the air sac is going to move into the lungs, okay? And then the bird is going to breathe in again, and the air moves into the next front air sac, and then the bird breathes out again, and the air is going to leave the body. So we've got one breath in giving us good air, and on that breath out, the air is going to move into the lungs, and then we've got air moving into the front air sac where we're going to store the dead air, or the air without a lot of oxygen, and then moving back out of the body. So a very efficient system. So please make sure you ask if you have any questions, and I will talk to you in class. Thanks. Bye.